Hi, welcome to week 6. This week we'll be thinking about sport ethics and drug use. We'll be looking at performance enhancing drugs. We'll be considering that argument from Simon. And then we'll also be looking at a few other drug issues or concepts out of Simon, Torres, and Hager. We will first be looking at Simon's article on good competition and drug-enhanced performance. Sport competition is often thought of as admirable when there's a quest for excellence. However, it can be argued that performance-enhancing drugs abolish or take away this quest for excellence. Simon, Torres, and Hager first are going to give us this criteria for how we can evaluate performance-enhancing drugs. Then he's going to lead us towards, thinking about these arguments that we can consider when determining whether performance-enhancing drugs in sport is indeed ethical. First of all, Simon brings out some concepts around this difficulty in classifying PEDs. First of all, we used to classify PEDs as something that was unnatural. However, the nature of performance-enhancing drugs is indeed that they are natural substances. We're just putting them in our body in maybe an unnatural way. It's also important to note that a performance-enhancing drug in one sport may indeed be a hindrance in another sport. Take, for example, a distance runner. A distance runner that takes testosterone to build bulk would indeed be a hindrance to their sport. Therefore, classifying one kind of performance-enhancing drug as the all-encompassing drug is difficult. So for Simon, he's going to give us this list and/or criteria. By the way, the list is not comprehensive, and quite frankly, it can be easily debated. However, it's a good starting point for us to at least think about a general classification of what is a performance-enhancing drug. Simon provides us this list for classifying PEDs. Please note, this list is taken in full from page 288 in Morgan's text. First, even if I asked you, how would you classify a performance-enhancing drug? This first criteria comes into place. The purpose for taking the drug is to increase performance, hence performance-enhancing drug. So we have to recognize, I think this is a great starting point. Our first criteria is that this substance, and particularly in the amount we consume this substance, we think it will indeed increase our performance. Second concept, when we classify a performance-enhancing drug, is that there's some risk involved in consuming the substance, especially in the amount to which we take it. We'll talk about this even more later in Simon, Torres, and Hager's discussion around performance-enhancing drugs. But for Simon's article and criteria, it's important to note he considers that a user is put at risk. There is a risk involved in consuming the drug, particularly in the given amount. And by the way, you can think about that risk twofold. You can think about it if indeed the risk is a health risk. Secondly, for many individuals taking these performance-enhancing drugs, there's a risk in being caught because it oftentimes breaks the rules of the given sport association. Finally, the third criteria Simon uses to classify a PED is that this substance being taken is not a prescribed medication to relieve an injury or illness. I want to clarify this a little bit. In our current sporting world, oftentimes medical professionals will indeed prescribe athletes these performance-enhancing drugs. And sometimes the purpose of the performance-enhancing drug is to increase the recovery from an injury. However, the ultimate goal in that recovery, we can argue, goes back to our first criteria, and that's performance. So a better way and an additional way to think about our third criteria is health and well-being. Does the individual take the prescribed drug because of their health and well-being? And for the most part, if we're talking about a true performance enhancer, no, they want to take it to enhance performance. We're going to move on now and talk about 3 arguments that Simon provides against the use of performance-enhancing drugs. The first argument is this notion of informed consent. The second argument is harm to others, and the third argument is harm and protection of the youth. We'll talk about harm to others and harm and protection of youth in our next slide. This slide, we are going to spend devoted to this idea of informed consent. So let me ask you the question. Do athletes truly have informed consent when choosing to take performance-enhancing drugs? Rather, I want us to think, are athletes coerced into taking performance-enhancing drugs? Does someone twist their arm? Are they indeed forced? Or can they truly consent to their own decisions? Let's think about this. Do athletes have a choice if another athlete indeed is taking performance-enhancing drugs? Therefore, are they coerced? Is coercion even an appropriate contention to explain why people, particularly high-level athletes, might indeed use? Okay, so let's think this way. We have such pressures on our top-level athletes that they have to be able to compete and maintain their livelihood. And therefore, you could argue they're forced, even maybe coerced into maintaining their high-level performance. And therefore, in order to do this, they take performance-enhancing drugs to maintain that competitive edge. Simon wants to say, though, however, that he believes coercion, is questionable. He wants to argue that athletes have a wide variety of choices when it comes to participation, when it comes to training, and even when it comes to their job. Therefore, he argues that because of the current society and we live in, and the vast number of choices, coercion is not a plausible excuse, because absolutely athletes can choose to do something else. They have a choice in the matter. And so he would think that this argument of informed consent and or coercion gives the idea that athletes don't have choices in the matter, when truly, at the end of the day, they do. Simon's second and third arguments against the use of performance-enhancing drugs are found here. We'll classify those as harm to others and harm to youth. First, let's start with that harm to others. One argument against PED use is that it causes harm to others. When one athlete chooses to take PEDs, a situation is created that forces the competitor to either choose to take the drugs or cease to be competitive. I want you to think about the example of Lance Armstrong and the Tour de France. Obviously, as you know, Lance Armstrong won 7 tours. He ultimately came out and claimed, after much denial, that he did indeed take performance-enhancing drugs. So in this instance, if we apply this idea of harm to others to Lance Armstrong and the Tour de France, we could argue that one rider, in the case of Lance Armstrong, taking performance-enhancing drugs and his domination of the sport, forced other competitors to take the drug too to remain relevant. Simon goes on, however, and has several points to counter this argument of harm to others. He first wants to raise the point there's a similar argument that can be made for excessive training regimens. If an athlete chooses to partake or engage in a dangerous training regimen, they indeed may create a similar situation that, in order for other athletes to maintain their competitive edge, they too have to engage in these kind of dangerous or serious training regimens, or they would cease to be competitive. Interestingly, though, as you know, our society doesn't typically classify this behavior of a training regimen as harming others. Furthermore, it could even be argued that the dangerous training regimen poses greater physical harm to participants than PED use, depending on the length of the drug use as well as the training regimen. Therefore, Simon wants to argue he doesn't believe that PED use and the argument of harm to others is appropriate. If we do not believe, that is, that unsafe training regimens cause harm to others, PED use should receive the same evaluation. The third common argument on preventing performance-enhancing drug use is this idea of harm to youth. This is that the belief is that we should restrict our high-level athletes because they are role models and they have distinct impact and influence on youth. Simon thinks this is a faulty argument. Rather, he thinks that the restrictions of high-level athletes can't be imposed based upon this argument of harm to youth. He goes on to say or think that there needs to be more oversight for youth athletes in the form of coaches, systems, and parents. Simply the argument that PED should be banned solely on the notion that high-level athletes impact and influence youth is just not acceptable. Simon provides us yet two more arguments against the use of performance-enhancing drugs in sports. These two arguments, however, take a little bit of a different approach than our previous three arguments. He calls these and gives this notion to the ideals of competitive sport as the reason for or arguments against performance-enhancing drugs. First of all, he gives us the concept of nature of competitive sport. So if I asked you, what is the purpose of sport? What's the nature of competitive sport? Many of you would argue, even if we go back to our argument we learned very early on in this course about suits. The nature of competitive sport is a test of ability. It's designed to determine what persons have the greatest ability in the designated competition. Then we have to take that a step further. The nature of competition in sport then is to not see what athlete's ability is best enhanced by a performance-enhancing drug. Is competitive sport about testing kind of these cyborg bodies or natural bodies? No, we want to know at the end of the day who has the greatest ability. Second, and maybe the most powerful argument that Simon provides, is that this notion of taking performance-enhancing drugs absolutely goes against the respect for opponent. Because of what we've talked about with competition and even sportsmanship, recall our mutual quest for excellence and or even mutualism. The nature of competitive sport calls for respect for your opponents. Respecting your opponent considers that your opponent is indeed trying to pose the greatest competitive challenge, just like you're doing. And we also think about that argument with sportsmanship. PED use ultimately degrades the opponent by simply considering the opponent as a means to an end, a stool to be stepped on. It's inherently selfish, many would argue. It takes advantage of our opponent. And therefore, PED use ultimately is a disrespect to our opponent. It takes away the competitive nature of sport. I do think it's interesting to think about one area of sport where we see where there could be some interesting dynamics to address. In the nature of bodybuilding, we have two categories. We have a category that's untested and we have a category that's tested. And under the untested category, competitors are not tested for performance-enhancing drugs. It's actually widely known and accepted that performers can and will take performance-enhancing drugs. However, there is a category that's tested. And under that category, we recognize that in doing so, there's a respect for your opponent and a nature for competitive sport. So in the instance of our untested bodybuilding category, go ahead, take your PEDs. It's accepted. It's expected. But in all other areas, as we see in the world of sport, there's a nature of competition and a respect for the opponent that must be considered when we talk about the ethical bounds of using performance-enhancing drugs. We're going to spend the remaining time of our lecture addressing Simon Torres and Hager's Chapter 4. This chapter on drugs, genes, and enhancing performance in sport will have several points and reiteration from Simon's previous article we've discussed, as well as some additional points. We have yet to address one of the key problems with performance-enhancing drugs, and that surrounds health concerns. It's widely known, widely accepted, and widely researched that there are known serious side effects from steroid use. And as steroid use and the prevention and detection of steroid use continues, there will be continual ways to try to find to get around this testing and to improve and or build upon the current state of performance-enhancing drugs. And that leads us to our kind of next 2 points of uncharted territory and lack of medical supervision. Uncharted territory comes in the form that some athletes stack steroids in such ways that the outcomes and side effects are unknown. The amounts ingested have never been tested because of the harm. It's not like our FDA allows individuals to be tested for these pieces in a way that we could then learn about the science of the drug. In addition, there's a lack of medical supervision, particularly because of this uncharted territory. Some athletes take steroids without any medical supervision, and or the medical supervision given may not have the full knowledge of the stacking of the drugs. With all of this in mind, it's important to note that there are indeed serious health concerns surrounding performance-enhancing drugs. We'll return to this notion a little bit later. We're going to spend the remaining time evaluating the use of PEDs according to Simon, Torres, and Hager. The first place we're going to go is this discussion of protection from harm. We've already seen this in Simon's article. Simon, Torres, and Hager take it a little further and give us some additional thoughts. It can be thought that steroid use causes harm to others. Therefore, we should protect athletes from harming themselves. This very notion of protecting athletes from making decisions for themselves is called paternalism. This approach considers that rules and regulations and self-assessment should be done to protect individuals from making the decisions for themselves. The trouble with paternalism in all aspects, as it applies to sport and as it applies to other areas of life, is that it restricts human liberty. So, for example, protection from harm. Most of us know, and or it's fairly common knowledge, that the use of cigarettes is harmful to your health. Therefore, a paternalistic approach would be that we would protect individuals from making those decisions for themselves about the use or purchase of cigarettes. However, as we know, there's trouble with that restriction. It restricts human liberty. In some ways, it's simply not acceptable to restrict human liberties. Think, for example, in the use of smoking. We're all well aware of the consequences, and it is our choices. And so Simon, Torres, and Hager have this approach that in some way, it's not acceptable to restrict human liberties of individuals. And therefore, they argue we furthermore can't restrict the liberties of athletes either. The contrast to this, or in contrast to paternalism, is Mills's harm principle. Mills brings out the argument that it's acceptable to limit liberty in a couple of instances. And according to Mills's harm principle, it's acceptable to limit liberty when we're preventing harm to others. And in the case of Mills believes it's acceptable to limit liberties and or be paternalistic in the case of children, mentally ill, and those who are coerced and or individually misinformed. Let me be very clear about that last part about coercion. In the instance of Mills, coercion is a serious issue. Think, for example, the Russian government and doping scandal. Those athletes were indeed coerced. Their life was on the line if they chose to go against their Russian Federation and doping. Therefore, for Mills, this harm principle surrounds again youth, mentally ill, and those who are coerced. Finally, I want us to think about this notion of protection from harm and informed consent. In today's age, any competent individual knows the potential ramifications and or side effects and or potential loss of outcomes when taking performance-enhancing drugs. Therefore, Simon, Torres, and Hager would argue that athletes are indeed informed, and they have informed consent. Next way we're going to evaluate the use of PEDs is coercion. And we talked about this prior in our discussion from Simon. Are athletes coerced, or are they forced into taking these performance-enhancing drugs? Clearly, as I've already indicated in the example of what we would say our Russian doping scandal, those athletes were coerced. However, Simon, Torres, and Hager want to state that an athlete has an ability to choose and act freely whether or not to use performance-enhancing drugs. And therefore, he wants to call into question, want to call into question this notion of that performance-enhancing drugs or the taking of them is coercive. Simon, Torres, and Hager want to bring about that pressure to take these drugs, to get the next contract, to maintain a competitive level is self-imposed. Pressures to be successful, just like in students, just like in business, and just like in athletics, are self-imposed. Because competitors take performance-enhancing drugs, some may feel forced to follow suit. Simon, Torres, and Hager would argue that pressure is indeed self-imposed. Finally, it's important to note that the problem with this is that all competitive activities are indeed coercive. We might be coerced to cheat on exams because we feel pressure to get an A in a class. We might feel coerced to steal or money launder because we feel pressure to do these things. Simon, Torres, and Hager want us to note that competition in and of itself may be coercive in nature. However, that does not give enough principle or value or implication that an individual is coerced into taking performance-enhancing drugs. Rather, Simon, Torres, and Hager want to reiterate there's choices in the matter. The next way we are going to evaluate the use of performance-enhancing drugs is a consideration of fairness versus cheating. As we have talked about at length throughout this course is this notion of cheating, and there's different approaches. We could take a formalist approach, we could take a conventionalist approach. As we know, for the most part, many would consider performance-enhancing drug use cheating because, as across the span of our sports, it's typically against the rules. We find very few areas where it's not against the rules. And so we could think about ways to classify cheating. I also want us to think about it in this notion of fairness. Is PED use fair to your competitors? And we talked about that under Simon's arguments when we thought about respect for our opponents. And here's another concept. Is it fair to the game? Is indeed performance-enhancing drug use fair to the game? So one, we have this notion of respect for persons or fairness to our competitor. And then secondly, we have this notion of, is it unfair to the competitive nature of sport? And we could argue that on many levels. Simon, Torres, and Hager do want us to think, though, that oftentimes we have changes in technology. And those changes in technology change the nature of the game. For example, our athletes run faster, jump higher in the world of track and field than they've ever done before. And while yes, this is devoted to many things, one of this is because of the nature of technology that has resulted. We have new surfaces, we have new implements, shoes, and the list goes on. And we wouldn't classify those as unfair. And so it's just important to note this notion of fairness and cheating. takes a very much a normative argument to be able to determine if the use of performance-enhancing drugs is unfair or if it's cheating. Our final way to evaluate the use of PEDs is this notion of ethics of good competition. This absolutely falls in line with our first article that Simon gave us. We have determined that athletics are indeed a test of ability, and the use of PEDs are counter to this notion. We could even think that athletes aren't responsible for their achievements. The drugs make the difference. And let's give an example of this instance. Many believe widely that Barry Bonds used performance-enhancing drugs in his quest to break the home run record. And we know that Barry Bonds hit 73 home runs. The argument then is that Barry Bonds isn't responsible for his achievements, but rather the drugs make the difference. That is, it's really difficult to determine, well, Barry Bonds, in and of his own athletic ability, might have been responsible for 55 home runs. But the remaining difference to, we'll say, the 73 home runs was because of the performance-enhancing drugs. And we don't know that because it's really difficult. But we can make some assumptions that athletes might not be responsible for their achievements, but the drugs make the difference. Simon, Torres, and Hager go on to offer 4 objections to this argument. And this notion of ethics of good competition, we've alluded to one prior. They first discuss this notion of new technologies. We allow new technologies. And some of our technological advancements, have corrected previous issues and defects. And we consider acceptable technological advancements that they don't change the nature of the game or contest. And so we're okay with these advancements and these moving forwards. So who's not to say that Barry Bonds broke the home run record because of advancing in technologies? There's also a discussion that changes in diet can be also regarded as performance enhancing. We know way more about nutrition and the science of it. Think also to the third point regarding training regimens. That is, athletes have advanced choices in training regimens and how those training regimens enhance performance. And yet we consider things like technology, diet, and training regimens just as ways to indeed get an advantage or to improve our performance. And we look at those rather vanilla or as harmless. Finally, this final objection is this notion of magic bullets. Many would argue that steroids are not magic bullets. That is, if I chose right now to take steroids and try to go out and break the home run record, I surely am not able to do so. That is, steroids aren't the only reason for this nature of how athletics are done. So athletes alone aren't successful because of their use of steroids. However, the problem with that then ultimately becomes we determine who responds best to the steroids, and that individual ultimately typically goes on and becomes a better competitor. Okay, let's take a step back and think about this. We've evaluated the use of performance-enhancing drugs a number of ways. And in this last slide, we've thought about it, this notion of the ethics of good competition, that the purpose of athletics is to test abilities. And therefore, if the purpose of athletics is to test abilities, then we also have to question technologies, diet, and training regimens. And finally, it's important to note that steroids and/or performance-enhancing drugs aren't magic bullets. That is, if we take them, we don't automatically become the best competitor. We have come to the conclusion of our Week 6 lecture. In this lecture, we started off by addressing Simon's article on good competition in drug-enhanced sport. In that article, we thought about what would be a good criteria for performance-enhancing drugs. We also addressed some arguments against the use of performance-enhancing drugs in the form of informed consent, harm to others, and harm and protection of the young. Then we gave a much more moral approach to performance-enhancing drugs when we considered the nature of competitive sport and respect for opponents. We then went on and talked about Simon Torres and Hager's Chapter 4 on drugs, genes, and enhancing performance in sport. We addressed health concerns. We talked about ways to think about paternalism, informed consent, Mills's harm principle, as well as coercion and freedom of sports. And finally, we talked about another way to evaluate PEDs as this idea of ethics of good competition. That brings us to the end of our Week 6 lecture. I'll see you all next week in Week 7.